Hi guys, it's Summers here and welcome to my Test 2 debrief. In this episode I'll give you a rundown of each team's progress during testing and also have a glance over any new parts they may have installed ahead of the Australian Grand Prix. First though, I'd just like to ask if you do go on to enjoy the video, don't forget to hit the like button and also subscribe to the channel for more Formula 1 content. You can also catch up with me either on my website, Patreon and social media channels where I also use the Summers F1 handle. Let's get started with Ferrari, a team that were quick out of the box and continued to pump in lap after lap throughout the first test, but was the second any different? Well, you'd have to say that whilst test 1 went relatively smoothly, there were some choppy waters for them to navigate during the second, with a tyre and wheel rim failure and an electrical issue reducing their time out on track at a time when you'd expect them to be gathering the most pertinent of data. However, they continued to impress on their long run pace, with the average lap time on the longer race simulation stints particularly impressive. Meanwhile, Vettel topped the headlines on the last day, clocking a 1:16.221 on the softest C5 tyre, just pipping Charles's best time the day before by just 1/100th of a second. From a development point of view, the team trialled a new floor at the second test, which featured a cluster of fins at several points along the outer section of the floor, correlating with the fully enclosed holes that run parallel to its edge. It's a similar design that they trialled in the latter phases of last season and will help to channel the airflow across and around these holes in order to improve their sealing effect on the edge of the floor. Moving over to Mercedes, and it was widely reported that the Silver Arrows were struggling at the first test, but contrary to those reports it appears that they were simply in beta test mode, putting on mileage and collating data for a more simplistic aerodynamic setup than the one that would be introduced at the second test. Now, I won't go into full detail on that package as I've already covered it in my last development diary. However, suffice to say the new package was extremely extensive and included a new nose, front wing, nose horns that flanked the S-duct, a halo winglet, new barge boards, new chassis fins, a new floor, a double T-wing and an extremely paired inside pod bodywork. And a partridge in a pear tree, to be honest, because frankly it was a huge update. All in all, a very impressive display by the Mercedes team, and one that the drivers seemed impressed with, suggesting that it would help to unlock the W10's potential. So, their woes, if you can call them that, certainly seem to be related to the performance of the tyres, an issue they've faced for a number of years now. They seem to have got a better handle of this towards the end of the test though, with their long run pace suggesting that they know how to make the tyres last over the course of a stint without a serious drop off, whilst Hamilton was able to post a time within a whisker of Vettel's best time of the test, whilst Bottas was actually only a few tenths behind that too. Red Bull are a little bit of an enigma for me at this stage, if I'm honest, as their times aren't indicative of a team that are chasing the leading pack, instead perhaps one that's falling into the clutches of those behind. The crash for Gasly on day 3 and the subsequent lack of running for Verstappen on day 4 makes them a difficult read, but for me I think they're a little bit adrift of where they'd actually like to be. They did introduce a new set of side pod deflectors during the second test, which featured vertical slots from their base. However, they also spent time evaluating the displacement of the diffuser, suggesting they feel the need to investigate instability at the rear of the car. They installed a rig with anchor points on either side of the exhaust and rear wing pylon, and the floor with strain gauges to measure the deflection, whilst checkered stickers and high-speed cameras were also in use to try to evaluate what was going on. If you haven't realised by now, I'm introducing these cars in what I perceive to be the current pecking order as we head to Melbourne. The problem that we might have with any established pecking order though is that Albert Park is a little out there when compared with the circuits we'll visit after that, and is often the reason why we end up with knee-jerk or reactionary calls to change the sport after just one race. So, if we get some poor racing at the first round, don't jump on a bandwagon or be disheartened. Just know that things might be different by the time you watch things unfold in Bahrain. The next phase of this debrief is going to get particularly difficult in terms of the running order, as for me there are numerous teams at the head of what we term the midfield battle, with me perhaps going as far to say that I think Red Bull could actually be pulled back into that battle too. However, I think Haas has a very slight advantage over their rivals when it comes to this area of the midfield, perhaps only really decided at this stage by their ease of running on all the tyre compounds, extracting decent pace over one lap and throughout a stint. However, where they will likely fall down is in the development race, unable to stay with the likes of Renault, who have a larger budget and much more resource at their disposal. So, moving on to Renault, much like last season, they seem to be a team looking for answers, trying to find those margins that will help to catapult them to the front of the midfield pack and hopefully give Hulkenberg his long-awaited podium and give Ricciardo a fighting chance against his and their old adversary Red Bull. During the second test, they conducted their usual Flovies and Kielprobe array test scenarios, but also set about some other, more obscure tests in order to survey any issues that may occur with their front and rear wings. Sauber Alfa Romeo have steadily gone about their business during both tests and have used their progress last season as a springboard for this, arriving with a very interesting and technical car for 2019. Like Haas and Renault mentioned before them though, I do see them as a challenger at the front of the midfield pack, but I think that their results will come down more to circuit characteristics, driver performance and how those around them do. I think it's also worth giving credit to Alfa Romeo when it comes to the fins that they've attached to the side of their chassis just around the suspension area. It's an area of development that I think we'll see adapted by most teams this season, especially as we've already seen Mercedes offer a similar solution with their B-spec specification that they introduced at the second test as well. Moving on to McLaren, I know that many of you would dearly like me to say that I think they've managed to pull themselves away from the obscurity of the last few years, and relatively speaking, I think they actually have. However, I think it will be foolhardy of me to say that they've jumped to the head of the midfield pack. Instead, I think they're what we'd consider smack bang in the middle, but more in reaching distance of that quartet ahead of them than the trouble behind. With a steady head, something that Sainz has shown to be in his locker in the past, I suspect they can pick up a decent haul of points when things go on around them. Toro Rosso's STR14 is probably one of the least adventurous cars I've seen from the team in a number of years, which is not to say it's poor by any stretch, but I don't see the usual level of design flair we've come to see and love from them. Again, I hope to see more from the team in the coming races, and I think a lot of the way in which they race in the opening phase of 2019 will come down to their understanding of the tyres and the performance of their drivers. Racing Point outwardly appear to have the luxury of a larger budget for 2019, but I think they're a team that will have to go through a lot of growing pains as they attempt to venture up the grid. Their mileage count for both tests was relatively low, and whilst the team have adopted the periscope style sidepod inlets, the rest of the car was devoid of many features that would make it distinguishable from last year's car. I suspect we'll see a different makeup for Australia, but I don't really see them coming on stream until a few races into the season, at which point they could have lost a fair bit of ground to those around them. Perhaps their greatest asset could once again be their ability to extract decent performance over the course of a race stint, but only time will tell if that's to be the case. Williams, meanwhile, are unfortunately stacked at the back of the pack in my fantasy pecking order, well adrift from those ahead of them and potentially in further trouble when we get to Australia due to the design of their wing mirrors and front suspension. Now, the wing mirrors are actually a relatively easy fix, but with much of the side pod's performance likely hinging on their shape and placement, it'll have further ramifications if deemed illegal, so let's hope they can avoid that. Meanwhile, the hoopla surrounding their suspension is in regard to another element that lies behind the rear leg of the lower wishbone, which clearly seemingly defies Article 10.3.5 of the regulations. The smaller element hidden in behind the wishbone is clearly done in order to impart an aerodynamic advantage of sorts, but it's unclear how it can be considered redundant as a suspension element. However, what if it's not a suspension element enclosed within the suspension-like shroud? What if it's actually one of the 3 tethers that are now required to be fixed to the upright from last year rather than the 2 that were in 2017? Anyway, I'll leave you all to think about that one, and let's see if it actually gets protested in Australia, or whether the teams keep stum and start developing their own interpretation, given it's clearly not giving Williams a massive performance uplift at this stage, but could be considered an interesting solution that the rest of the grid might chase. The battle at the head of the midfield is going to be utterly breathless, especially if the drivers can follow each other a little more closely this year without overheating the front tyres. This then opens up what I hope will become a fascinating strategic battle, with those who dare to be aggressive able to win out, as they are no longer hindered by the traffic they'd ordinarily face in their pit window. Now, for those who don't know what I mean when I reference the pit window, it's an expression of their current position on the track relative to where they'd be if they had to stop. To understand how this would affect a driver, you just need to know the pit stop lost time, which is roughly 23 seconds in Australia. So anyone less than 23 seconds behind you is effectively in your window and can be considered a strategic factor in your race. Now, the race strategist's job is to monitor a driver's time drop-off relative to this gap and find a window in which they'd ordinarily come out of in free air and be less affected by the cars around them. This has become even more critical in recent years, as spending time behind someone on older tyres that you couldn't overtake would take unnecessary life from your tyres and impact on your overall race strategy. However, this school of thought may be less of a problem if drivers are less affected by the dirty wake ahead and can use the emboldened drag reduction system to their advantage. Well, let's hope anyway, eh? Don't forget, if you have enjoyed the video, please hit the like button and also subscribe to the channel for more Formula 1 content.